Today we're going to be reading the first chapter of the Pagemaster. We're going to read about half of it because the chapter is so long, and then we're going to stop recording and make another video of the second half. Let's get into it. The Pagemaster by David Kirschner and Ernie Contreras. Illustrations by Jerry Tiritilli. Richard. Dark, dangerous storm clouds filled the night sky. They shifted and twisted and swirled into terrible shapes. Pirate ships, haunted houses, dragons. Lightning flashed. Thunder exploded. 10-year-old Richard Tyler sprang up in his bed, gasping for breath. He could feel his heart pounding. It must be a dream, he told himself. Just another bad dream. At this time of night, most 10-year-old boys were fast asleep, dreaming about things like playing baseball, riding bikes, and climbing trees. But Richard Tyler was not a typical 10-year-old. He dreamed about things like being struck by lightning, getting sucked into tornadoes, or falling into the Grand Canyon. To Richard, the world was the scariest place imaginable. A dangerous place full of accidents waiting to happen. If a 10-year-old ever expected to make it to 11, he'd better be prepared for these dangers. Richard fanned his emergency flashlight around his room, lighting up his fire extinguishers, his earthquake kits, and his crash helmets. The flashlight also lit up some of his favorite wall signs. No smoking. Caution. Beware. Looking out the window, he saw dark clouds near the horizon, somewhere beyond the town. Maybe he wasn't dreaming. Then suddenly, without any warning, lightning lit up the sky. Richard panicked. Grabbing one of his crash helmets, he ran out the door. Hurrying down the hall, he headed for the safest place he knew, his parents' bedroom. As usual, the door was not quite shut. He was about to knock on it when he heard his parents talking. "How can you say that?" his father was asking. "You know Richard is not a normal kid." Richard realized that they were talking about him. He took off his helmet and listened. "Of course he's normal," his mother argued. "Every 10-year-old is afraid of something." "Yeah, but every 10-year-old isn't afraid of everything," his father answered. "Claire, the boy is even afraid of tuna." Wrong, Richard thought. He wasn't afraid of tuna. The high levels of mercury found in some tuna was what worried him. Richard peeked in through the crack in the doorway. His dad was looking out the window into the backyard, probably inspecting the treehouse he was building. His dad was always trying to get Richard involved in high-risk activities, like treehouses and Little League. "Alan, the world is a frightening place for him right now," said his mother. "I think that last earthquake was just too much for him. Right now, we need to be as supportive as possible." "Supportive? I'm running out of supportive things to do. I signed him up for Little League, and he drove the team crazy with statistics about shin splints leading to blood clots in his legs. He even brought in medical evidence. No one wanted to play after that." Richard watched his father walk away from the window and plop down on the big bed. He had a hopeless look on his face. "I just want to be a good father, Claire. That's all." Suddenly, Richard saw his problems from his parents' point of view. He no longer felt like going into their room. Back in his own room, Richard sank down on his bed. The beam from his flashlight created a circle of light on the ceiling. It reminded him of a full moon. Then he remembered that statistics showed that violent crimes increased during full moons. Probably werewolves did too. As far as Richard was concerned, no one had ever disproved the existence of werewolves. His heart beat faster at the thought, and he fanned the flashlight under his bed just in case. No werewolves there. Just a life preserver and 2 more earthquake kits. As he crawled under the covers, he began to think about his dad again. Richard really didn't want to be a disappointment to him. Starting tomorrow, he'd try to act more like a normal kid. But that wasn't gonna be easy. The next morning, Richard hurried over to the window to see how much destruction the storm had caused. He didn't expect to see many houses still standing. To his amazement, the whole neighborhood had been spared. The lightning hadn't destroyed a single house. Richard stared out the window at the green lawns, the colorful gardens, and the pretty houses. It was a nice neighborhood, he thought. But what did that prove? Even in the nicest neighborhoods, danger could lurk around every corner. He watched a cluster of bike-riding kids race around the corner onto his street. They were pedaling at full speed into driveways and jumping their bikes off the curb. They called it catching air when both of the wheels left the ground. The way they all wooed and yahooed and slapped high fives, you would think they had just found a cure for the common cold. Watching from the safety of his room, Richard figured there would be no less than 3 broken legs, 2 cracked heads, and 1 ruptured spleen. He was all ready to call 911. If the emergency line was busy, he could help out himself. After all, he was certified in first aid, CPR, and the Heimlich maneuver. But no one fell. He guessed that some kids were just lucky that way. To please his father, Richard decided to take an interest in the treehouse he was building. Not that he had really any interest in it, but he would try to act as if he did, if it would make his dad happy. He pushed open the screen door and walked out into the messy backyard. Pieces of wood and tools were scattered around the treehouse construction area. Plenty of safety violations there, Richard noticed. "How's it going, Dad?" Richard looked up into the treehouse where his dad was hammering away. His father was surprised to hear the boy's voice. "Richard," he shouted, "how do you like it?" His dad gestured around the treehouse like a tour guide. It looks great." Actually, to Richard, it looked like a bunch of boards that the wind might have blown into the tree branches, but his dad seemed pretty pleased by the compliment. "Hey, Rich, how about bringing up that bag of nails?" His dad pointed down to the paper bag next to Richard's feet. Sure." Richard lifted the bag and held it up over his head. Come on, the view's terrific," his dad said. Though Richard wanted to please his father, he couldn't ignore the obvious. He pointed at the ladder. "Dad, 8% of all household accidents involve ladders, and another 3% involve trees. You're dealing with an 11% probability. I'll just stay on the ground if you don't mind." "I give up," he heard his dad mumble. "Just hand me the nails." Richard held the bag as high as he could, and his dad reached down as far as he could. Unfortunately, his dad reached a little too far. His feet slid down the ladder, and he crashed face first into the grass. Richard's mom ran out of the house and hurried over to her husband. "Honey, are you all right?" Richard's father couldn't answer immediately. He was too busy spitting out large clumps of grass and dirt out of his mouth. "I tried to warn him about the ladder." Richard shook his head. His dad picked up the bag of nails and reached inside. There were only a few left. He turned toward his son. "Rich, here's something you can do." He placed a nail in Richard's hand. "Go down to Gutman's Hardware and pick up a pound of these nails." Richard turned to his mother. "Mom, do I have to?" His mother knelt down beside him. "Richie, Gutman's is just a short bike ride into town." But most traffic accidents happen within 3 blocks of the home." "Rich, you can't base your whole life on statistics. You've got to take some chances once in a while," his father said. He stuffed a $5 bill into the boy's clenched fist. "This is not good. Not good at all," Richard muttered as he headed for the garage. A few minutes later, the automatic garage door jerked open with a loud bang. There sat Richard, balancing on his bike. He looked like some creature from outer space. On his head, he wore a hockey helmet equipped with multiple reflectors and rearview mirrors. A yellow jacket streaked with orange fluorescent tape covered the upper part of his body. His bike was outfitted with every accessory ever designed for biking safety. Lights, reflectors, mirrors, fenders, horns, bells, basket, fire extinguisher, and earthquake and first aid kits. So far, Richard hadn't figured out how to install an airbag, but he was working on it. He grunted as he pushed off down the driveway. With all of its safety devices, the bike was heavier than a Volvo. It wobbled slowly across the sidewalk and off into the road and the dangerous unknown. As the bike bounced and wobbled up the quiet street, Richard kept his eyes wide open for any possible danger. At every intersection, he stopped and looked carefully in all four directions. He was so busy looking for any signs of dangerous traffic that he failed to see the dark storm clouds gathering behind him. Turning a corner, he met up with the same kids he'd seen earlier riding their bikes. They had constructed a ramp, a wooden plank propped up on a stack of cinder blocks. The kids were catching major air off the ramp. Richard thought of turning back before he was noticed. "Hey, check it out!" one of the kids shouted at the top of his lungs. "It's Richie Tyler! Look what he's wearing!" "Yeah, where you going, Tyler? The moon?" The kids skidded 180s on both sides of the ramp, forming a bike blockade across the street. The only way for Richard to get through was over the ramp. "Come on, Tyler, catch some air. Go for it." But Richard wasn't about to try anything as dangerous as that. He turned his bike around and pedaled off in the opposite direction. He heard the kids laughing behind him. At this point, Richard really wanted to go home, but he couldn't disappoint his dad by returning home empty-handed. He decided to turn down a side street, even if it meant taking a longer, scarier way into town. A strong wind began to blow, and the lonely street got darker. Glancing up at the sky, Richard spotted the threatening black storm clouds. There was a bright flash of lightning, followed by a loud crack of thunder. Then came the rain, pouring down in thick, driving sheets. Richard had to find shelter, fast! He pedaled frantically into the park, steering his bike down a wet, tree-lined path. A violent blast of wind snapped a thick branch from a tree. It fell across his path. Richard swerved to avoid the branch and crashed helmet first into the concrete base of a statue. Flying off the bike, he hit the ground with a thud. He took off his helmet and felt his head for injuries. There was another brilliant flash of lightning. Richard looked up at the big bronze statue of the town's founding father. The huge metal figure was pointing off towards a big stone building at the end of the park. Richard decided to go where the statue was pointing. Leaving his bike and his helmet behind, he scrambled to his feet and ran for the building as fast as his legs could carry him. The building was huge. Across the front, there were marble columns the size of giant redwoods. Marble steps led up to a tall oak door, and a pair of ferocious-looking lion statues guarded both sides of the entrance. Richard ran up the steps, trying not to look at the fierce lions. He pulled the tall oak door toward him and stepped inside. The door swung closed, pushing Richard forward. Though he was surrounded by darkness, Richard sensed that he was standing in a huge, cavernous room. He couldn't imagine what dangers might be hidden there. Blood-sucking bats? Man-eating monsters? Poisonous snakes? Or perhaps there was a crypt where mummies were buried. Suddenly, he panicked. He wanted to get out, but as he turned to exit, he noticed a long rectangle of light reflected on the dark floor. It was coming from an open door where a strange and hideous black creature was standing. All at once, the creature lunged forward toward Richard. It was grunting and breathing heavily. Richard tried to run, but his wet sneakers slipped on the smooth floor. He stumbled backwards into a wall. Escape was impossible. Richard shut his eyes tightly and waited for the end. Then he heard a man's voice echoing in the darkness. "That's some storm out there." Richard opened one eye and then the other. Standing in the rectangle of light, the creature turned out to be just an old man carrying a stack of books. He placed the books on a nearby desk, then reached for a light panel on the wall. As he clicked the switches one by one, long rows of sparkling chandeliers lighted up, revealing a vast space filled with rows upon rows of books. Whole walls of books stretching as far as the eye could see. "Welcome to the library, my young friend." The old man took out a handkerchief and wiped his brow. "I'm the librarian, Mr. Dewey." Mr. Dewey offered his handkerchief to Richard, whose face was wet from the rain. In fact, there were pools of water where he stood. "No thanks." Richard said, fearing that the old man's handkerchief might be filled with germs. He was careful not to take his eyes off the strange old librarian. Mr. Dewey's hair grew straight up out of his head like white grass, and his face had more wrinkles than his dirty old white handkerchief, but his eyes were sharp and clear. They sparkled, as if they knew things that no one else knew. Mr. Dewey leaned in close to Richard. I expect you're here for a special book. Book? Mister, I just need a... Wait! Mr. Dewey gestured for Richard to be quiet. Allow me to guess. I have a talent for guessing what people need. Richard was afraid that the old man might become violent, so he let him have his way. I know. You're in need of a fantasy. Brave knights, mythical fairies, ferocious dragons, damsels in distress. Mr. Dewey raised his bushy eyebrows. Richard shook his head. No, look, all I want is... Adventure! Of course, you're a boy who loves adventure. You must be to have braved a horrible storm like this. Mr. Dewey glanced up toward the rain-soaked windows. Adventure! Brimming with wicked villains, buried treasure, and dirty cutthroat pirates. He drew his finger across his neck to illustrate his words. Richard massaged his throat. No, that's not it. Lightning flooded the high windows. Mr. Dewey poked his face up to Richard's. Horror! Evil demons, wretched monsters, haunted houses, graveyards. He wrung his hands and licked his lips like Quasimodo, the famous hunchback of Notre Dame. Richard gulped, too terrified to speak. Yes, it's horror for you, boy, I'm sure of it. Mr. Dewey held out his hand. Your library card, please. I don't have one. Don't have a library card? The old man looked amazed. Well, now you do. Mr. Dewey suddenly produced a library card from between his fingers and placed it on the desk next to Richard. Sign there, last name first. Richard did as he was told. Mr. Dewey picked up the card and held it close to his eyes. Richard Tyler. He proudly handed the card to Richard. Mr. Tyler, consider this your passport through the wonderful and quite unpredictable world of books. But I'm not here for any books. Richard felt relieved that he had finally gotten the words out. That's what I've been trying to tell you. I just came in because of the storm. You mean you don't need? Mr. Dewey was disappointed. Oh, I see. Is there a phone I can use to call my parents? Richard looked around. Mr. Dewey shook his head and sighed as if he had lost something of great value. Then he pointed off into the library, saying, Through there. Richard looked in the direction Mr. Dewey's finger was pointing, but he saw nothing except endless rows of book stacks. Proceed in a northeasterly direction and continue on to the rotunda, the old man explained. From the rotunda, head west through the fiction section. There you will find the public telephone. You can't miss it. Richard walked up toward the book stacks. The aisles seemed to go on forever. He might never find his way out of here. His knees began to shake. Don't be afraid, boy. Mr. Dewey's voice echoed in the huge room. If you lose your way, merely direct yourself back to the exit sign. Richard looked back. Mr. Dewey was pointing toward the glowing green exit sign high over the big oak doors. This was hopeful, Richard thought. An exit sign meant there was a possibility of escape. Just as another clap of thunder rumbled overhead, Richard cautiously took his first step into the unknown. Back home, Richard's mom stared out the window at the pouring rain. She would have given anything to see her son ride his crazy-looking bike up the driveway. Richard's dad was on the phone. Come on, he was muttering to himself. This was not the time to be on hold. Hello, Mr. Gutman. This is Alan Tyler. My son, Richard. Is he there? Yeah, that's him. The kid with the earthquake kits. You haven't seen him? The disappointment was evident in his voice. Please call if he comes in. Thank you. He turned to his wife. He never got there. Hanging up the phone, he grabbed his keys from the coffee table. I'm going out to find him, he said, and bolted out the front door into the pouring rain. I'm coming with you. Richard's mom grabbed 2 coats from the rack beside the door and ran after her husband. Book stacks shot up on each side of Richard like skyscrapers. Every once in a while, he glanced back to check on the exit sign. It was still there. Finally, he stepped out from an aisle into a wide open circular space. He must have reached the rotunda, the center of the library. There, all the sections came together. A cut marble image of a compass was inlaid into the floor. Now, which way did Mr. Dewey say the phone was? North, south, east, or west? Richard looked in every direction, searching for a clue. Finally, he looked up. Jeez! He was standing directly under the big dome of the huge library building. Spanning the curved surface of the dome was an amazing mural. It included, in brilliant colors, some of the greatest heroes and villains of classic fiction. Richard recognized the pirate Long John Silver, the two-faced Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the Frankenstein monster. In the center of the mural, the artist had painted the image of a wizened old man. He wore a long white beard and clutched a book edged in shimmering gold. His sharp eyes stared down at Richard like an eagle eyeing its prey. Bang! A clap of thunder rattled the book stacks. Richard jumped back in surprise. Once again, his wet sneakers slipped out from underneath him. As he fell backwards, his head hit the hard and unforgiving marble floor. Then, everything went black. When Richard came to, he was lying flat on his back in the center of the rotunda floor. Everything was pitch black. He expected Mr. Dewey to snap the switches again and bring back the light, but the darkness remained. Hello? He said, hoping that someone would answer, but his voice came back with a hollow echo. Low, low, low. A cold icicle of fear shot up his spine. When he looked for the exit sign, it was nowhere in sight. Not good, he thought. Not good at all. Lightning flashed through the high windows again, lighting up the rotunda dome. Instinctively, Richard looked up and gasped in terror. Was he really seeing what he thought he saw? Shadows climbing out of the mural? A second flash of lightning confirmed his fears. The painted images had come to life and were climbing down the rotunda columns. Then Richard heard footsteps coming from the shadows around him. And this is where we're going to pause.